The rain-slicked streets of Boston glistened under the dim orange glow of streetlights. Sophie Hayes pulled her coat tighter around her body as a cold breeze cut through the November air. Her breath escaped in soft clouds and she quickened her pace, clutching her tote bag close to her side. The evening had been lovely, a literary event filled with poetry readings and warm cups of tea, but now with the city quiet and the streets nearly deserted, unease prickled at the back of her neck. She glanced over her shoulder, her steps faltering when she noticed two men lingering near the corner behind her. They weren't speaking, but their movements were deliberate, their presence unmistakably focused on her. Sophie's heart began to race and she turned forward, willing herself to remain calm as she tried to appear composed. Her efforts failed when she heard their footsteps quicken. The familiar weight of fear pressed down on her chest, squeezing her lungs until her breath came in shallow gasps. She glanced around, searching for help, but the street was empty, the shop windows dark. Her fingers fumbled for her phone, but before she could dial, one of the men called out. "Hey sweetheart," he said, his voice low and mocking. She froze, her pulse thundering in her ears as the men drew closer, their shadows long and menacing under the streetlights. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" the second man added, his tone dripping with false charm. Sophie's legs felt like lead, rooted to the ground as panic surged through her. She opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. Her mind screamed for her to move, to run, but fear held her captive. Then, as if summoned by the very depths of her desperation, a voice cut through the night. "Leave her alone." The words were sharp, commanding, and they froze everyone in place. Sophie's wide eyes darted toward the source of the voice. A woman stepped out of the shadows, her figure silhouetted against the faint glow of a street lamp. She was tall, with a confident stance that spoke of quiet power. Her leather jacket gleamed faintly in the light, and her dark jeans were tucked into boots that made her look as though she belonged in a different story altogether, one where danger bowed to her will. The two men exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering under the woman's piercing gaze. "Mind your business," one of them said, though his voice lacked the same arrogance as before. The woman didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her hands loose at her sides but ready. "I said leave her alone," she repeated, her tone calm but carrying an edge that could cut through steel. Sophie's breath hitched as the tension thickened. One of the men sneered, taking a step forward. "Or what?" he asked, though his bravado wavered. In an instant the woman moved. Her actions were swift, precise, and almost too quick to follow. A sharp kick to the knee sent one of the men staggering back, and a well-aimed elbow to the other's stomach left him doubled over, gasping for air. The sound of their curses filled the air as they scrambled to retreat, their earlier confidence shattered. Within moments they were gone, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared. Sophie remained frozen, her heart pounding as the adrenaline coursed through her veins. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the woman's steady voice. "You're safe now," she said, turning to face Sophie. Up close, Sophie could see her savior more clearly. Her short, dark hair was damp from the misty air, and her sharp blue eyes held an intensity that made Sophie's breath catch. A faint scar curved along her left cheek, adding to the air of mystery that surrounded her. "Are you okay?" the woman asked, her voice softer now. Sophie nodded shakily, though her legs felt like jelly. I think so," she managed, her voice barely audible. The woman's gaze softened and she stepped closer, her movements careful as though approaching a frightened animal. "It's over," she said gently. "They're not coming back." Sophie exhaled a shaky breath, her knees threatening to give out beneath her. The woman reached out, steadying her with a firm but gentle hand on her arm. "Thank you," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," the woman replied. "Are you close? I can walk you home." Sophie hesitated, the fear still fresh in her mind. But there was something in the woman's tone, an unspoken assurance, that made her nod. "Yes. Just a few blocks from here." The woman nodded, releasing Sophie's arm but staying close. "Let's get you there safely." As they walked, Sophie stole glances at the woman beside her. She moved with a quiet confidence, her eyes scanning their surroundings with a focus that was both reassuring and unnerving. "Who are you?" Sophie asked finally, her voice hesitant. "Eve," the woman said simply. "Evelyn Carter. Most people just call me Eve." Thank you, Eve, Sophie said, her voice soft. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there. Eve glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. You don't have to thank me, she said. I'm just glad I was there in time. As they reached Sophie's apartment building, the tension in Sophie's chest began to ease. She turned to Eve, her expression a mix of gratitude and curiosity. Can I at least offer you some tea? It's the least I can do. Eve shook her head, her smile tinged with something unreadable. Not tonight, she said. But take care of yourself, Sophie. And don't hesitate to call for help if you ever need it. Before Sophie could respond, Eve turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind a swirl of unanswered questions and a lingering sense of safety. Sophie stood there for a long moment, staring after her. For the first time in years, her heart stirred with something unfamiliar, something that felt like hope. Sophie stood in the shadow of her apartment building, her breathing still unsteady as she tried to process what had just happened. Her savior, Eve, stood a few steps away, her hands in the pockets of her leather jacket, radiating a calmness that felt almost surreal after the chaos of moments ago. You're shaking, Eve said, her voice steady but laced with concern. She took a step closer, her sharp blue eyes locking onto Sophie's. Are you sure you're okay? Sophie nodded, though the tremble in her hands betrayed her. I think so, she stammered, her voice thin. I don't know how to thank you. If you hadn't. Eve held up a hand, cutting her off. Don't, she said simply. You don't have to thank me. You're okay. That's what matters. The simplicity of her words, the certainty in her tone, left Sophie momentarily speechless. Eve's presence was overwhelming in a way Sophie couldn't explain, an intensity that seemed to pull the air from the space between them. Let me walk you home, Eve said after a moment, her voice softening. Sophie hesitated. The fear of the night still clung to her, but there was something about Eve, a steadiness, a quiet confidence, that made her feel safe. She nodded. Hey. It's not far. Eve gestured for her to lead the way, falling into step beside her as they moved down the dimly lit street. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. Sophie's heart still raced, her body tense as she glanced over her shoulder more often than she needed to. Eve noticed and spoke without looking at her. They're not coming back, she said, her voice calm but firm. You don't have to keep looking over your shoulder. Sophie nodded, embarrassed by how obvious her fear was. I know, she said quietly. It's just, I've never been in a situation like that before. I didn't know what to do. Eve glanced at her, a faint smile playing at her lips. You don't have to be ready for something like that, she said. It's not your job to be. There was something in the way she said it, a kind of assurance that Sophie hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't condescending or dismissive. It was understanding, and it eased the tightness in her chest just a little. As they walked, Sophie found her eyes drawn to Eve. The streetlights illuminated her features in flashes, highlighting the sharp angles of her jawline, the faint scar on her cheek, the way her eyes seemed to absorb every detail around them. She moved with a kind of effortless confidence, as though she belonged to the night in a way Sophie never could. Do you live nearby? Sophie asked, desperate to break the silence and to satisfy the curiosity bubbling inside her. Sort of, Eve said with a shrug. I run a garage a few blocks over. Most of the time I crash there. A garage? Sophie asked, surprised. You're a mechanic? Eve's lips twitched into a smirk. Don't sound so shocked, she teased. No, I didn't expect that, Sophie admitted, her cheeks warming. I guess I don't meet many mechanics who also happen to rescue strangers on the street. Eve chuckled, a low, warm sound that sent an unexpected flutter through Sophie's chest. Well, I like to keep people guessing, she said. The conversation flowed more easily after that, Eve's dry humor and relaxed demeanor drawing Sophie out of her shell. They talked about Boston, about books and cars, and little things that felt inconsequential but comforting. Sophie found herself smiling more than she had in months, and each time Eve laughed, Sophie felt a warmth she couldn't quite place. But there was something else, something in Eve's eyes when she thought Sophie wasn't looking. A shadow, a weight, as though she carried something she couldn't put down. It intrigued Sophie as much as it unsettled her, and she found herself wanting to know more. Do you always step in to save random strangers? Sophie asked as they reached the corner of her street. Eve tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. Not always, she said. But I was in the right place at the right time tonight. I'm glad I was. Sophie stopped in front of her building, turning to face Eve fully. I don't know how to thank you, she said again, her voice quieter this time. Really? You didn't have to. I did, Eve interrupted gently, her blue eyes meeting Sophie's with a sincerity that made her breath hitch. And I would again. You don't owe me anything, Sophie. The way she said her name, soft and deliberate, sent a shiver down Sophie's spine. Sophie hesitated at the door, her hand resting on the cool metal handle. She didn't want the night to end, didn't want to let Eve disappear back into the shadows. Would you like to come in for some tea? Sophie offered, her voice trembling slightly. Eve smiled, but there was something wistful in it, something that made Sophie's heart ache. Not tonight, she said, her tone apologetic. But you take care of yourself, okay? And don't let this scare you off from walking at night. Just, maybe stick to busier streets. Sophie nodded, though disappointment tugged at her chest. Okay, she said softly. Eve turned to leave, her boots crunching softly against the pavement. But before she disappeared into the night, she glanced back, her eyes meeting Sophie's one last time. Good night, Sophie, she said, her voice low and warm. Good night, Eve, Sophie replied, watching as the woman who had saved her melted into the darkness. Sophie stood there for a long moment, the cool night air brushing against her skin. Despite the fear and chaos of the evening, she felt something stir within her. A curiosity, a spark, a fragile sense of connection she hadn't felt in years. And as she turned and stepped inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed in a way she didn't yet understand. The mid-morning sun peeked through the overcast sky as Sophie made her way down the street, her steps hesitant but purposeful. Her fingers clutched the strap of her bag tightly, and her heart raced with a nervous energy she couldn't quite shake. 4 days, Eve had been a constant presence in her mind, her cool confidence and quiet strength replaying like a film she couldn't turn off. She had told herself this was just about expressing gratitude, nothing more. Yet as she approached the garage Eve had mentioned, Sophie couldn't ignore the flutter of excitement mingling with her nerves. The scent of motor oil and metal hit her as she stepped onto the gravel lot. The large metal door to the garage was rolled up, revealing the cavernous space inside. Tools hung neatly along the walls, and the sound of a radio playing soft rock filled the air. Sophie's gaze swept the room until it landed on a figure crouched next to an old car near the back of the garage. There she was. Eve was bent over the hood of a deep green vintage Mustang, her focus completely absorbed in her work. Her hair, slightly damp with sweat, clung to her forehead, and her hands were smeared with grease as she turned a wrench with practiced ease. She wore a fitted black tank top that revealed toned arms, her jeans worn and frayed at the edges. Sophie stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. She had never seen someone look so utterly in their element. There was something captivating about the way Eve moved, her motions fluid and precise, her focus unshakable. For a moment, Sophie felt like an intruder, but the sound of her boots crunching against the gravel betrayed her presence. Eve glanced up, her sharp blue eyes landing on Sophie. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by a small, knowing smile. Well, this is unexpected, Eve said, setting down the wrench and wiping her hands on a rag tucked into her back pocket. What brings you here, Sophie? Sophie hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish for showing up unannounced. I just wanted to thank you, she said, her voice faltering slightly. Properly, I mean. For the other night. Eve tilted her head, her smile softening. I thought we already covered that, she said, crossing her arms. You don't owe me anything. I know, Sophie replied quickly, stepping further into the garage. But it didn't feel right to just let it go. You helped me when I needed it most. That means something. Eve's expression shifted, her eyes searching Sophie's face as though trying to read something unspoken. After a moment, she nodded toward a battered metal stool near the car. Well, since you're here, have a seat. I was just finishing up. Sophie perched on the stool, watching as Eve returned to her work. Her movements were deliberate, her hands deftly maneuvering tools as she adjusted something deep within the car's engine. Sophie found herself mesmerized, her earlier nerves melting away as curiosity took over. You're really good at this, Sophie said, her voice softer now. Eve smirked, glancing at her over her shoulder. I'd hope so, she said. I've been doing it long enough. Do you always work on cars like this? Sophie asked. Pretty much, Eve replied, leaning back to assess her progress. There's something satisfying about it. Fixing things. Bringing them back to life. Sophie tilted her head, sensing a deeper meaning in Eve's words. Is that why you do it? Because it's satisfying? Eve paused, her hand hovering over the engine for a moment before she looked back at Sophie. Partly, she admitted. And partly because it keeps me busy. Keeps my mind from wandering too much. The weight in her voice wasn't lost on Sophie. There was more to Eve's answer, more than she was willing to share. But Sophie didn't press. Eve finished tightening a bolt and closed the hood of the car with a satisfying thud. She wiped her hands on the rag again before leaning against the side of the car, her arms crossed as she regarded Sophie. So, what do you think? Eve asked, nodding toward the car. It's beautiful, Sophie said, her eyes tracing the car's sleek lines. You must have put a lot of work into it. Months, Eve said with a small chuckle. But it's worth it. There's nothing like seeing something broken come back to life. Sophie smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. I think I can see why you love it here, she said, gesturing to the garage. It feels grounded. Like it's yours. Eve's gaze softened and she nodded. It is, she said. This place, it's the one thing in my life that makes sense. Their eyes met and for a moment the world outside the garage seemed to fade away. Sophie felt the pull of something unspoken, something magnetic in the way Eve looked at her, as if seeing more than just a nervous librarian sitting on a stool. Thank you, Sophie said again, her voice barely above a whisper. For what? Eve asked, her brows knitting together. For letting me see this side of you, Sophie said. Eve's lips curved into a small, almost shy smile, a vulnerability that Sophie hadn't seen before. Anytime, she said softly. As Sophie stood to leave, Eve walked her to the edge of the garage, the air between them charged with a quiet tension. Take care of yourself, Sophie, Eve said, her voice low but warm. You too, Sophie replied, hesitating at the edge of the lot. Maybe I'll see you around? Eve smirked, her blue eyes glinting with something playful. You know where to find me. Sophie smiled, her heart fluttering as she turned and walked away. She couldn't explain it, but something about that visit felt like the beginning of something new, something that scared her but that she couldn't wait to explore. The rain had long since stopped, leaving the air crisp and cool as Sophie sat across from Eve in the back corner of the garage. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a soft glow, making the grease-streaked tools on the workbench gleam like treasures in the dim room. A half-empty mug of coffee sat between them, forgotten as their conversation drifted from casual pleasantries into something deeper. I can't believe you read Pride and Prejudice, Sophie said, a grin pulling at her lips as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Eve smirked, leaning back in her chair with her arms crossed. What, you think mechanics don't read Jane Austen? No, Sophie hesitated, realizing how it sounded. I didn't expect you to. I'm full of surprises, Eve said, a mischievous glint in her eye. Sophie chuckled, shaking her head. I'm starting to realize that. Their conversation had begun awkwardly when Sophie first arrived, her nerves tangling her words as she tried to explain her reason for showing up unannounced. But Eve, though visibly surprised, had welcomed her with a warmth that Sophie hadn't anticipated. They had started with small talk, safe topics like books, music, and movies, but as the hours passed, Sophie found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years. She told Eve about her work at the library, her love for organizing book displays, and her dream of one day running her own bookstore. She even hinted at the heartbreak that had left her wary of trusting others, though she didn't delve into the details. Eve, for her part, listened intently, her blue eyes fixed on Sophie as though she were the only person in the world. Her wit and humor kept the conversation light, but Sophie couldn't help noticing the way Eve deflected when the questions turned toward her. So what about you? Sophie asked, her curiosity piqued. How did you end up running a garage? Eve's smile faltered just for a moment before she shrugged. I've always liked fixing things, she said simply. Cars, bikes, it's what I'm good at. That's it. Sophie pressed gently. There's no grand story behind it? Eve hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor for a split second before meeting Sophie's again. Not really, she said, her tone carefully neutral. It's just what I do. Sophie sensed there was more, something Eve wasn't saying, but she didn't push. Instead, she changed the subject and the tension in the room eased as Eve's smirk returned. Over the next few weeks, their connection deepened. Eve began to show up unexpectedly at the library where Sophie worked, always finding some excuse to linger. "Hey, librarian," Eve said one afternoon, leaning casually against the counter with a paper bag in her hand. "Thought you could use a real lunch." Sophie looked up from the stack of books she was sorting, her cheeks flushing at the sight of Eve's easy smile. "You didn't have to do that," she said, though her heart fluttered at the gesture. "I know," Eve replied, sliding the bag across the counter. "But I figured you'd be too busy alphabetizing to remember to eat." Sophie laughed, shaking her head. "You make it sound like that's all I do. Isn't it?" Eve teased, her grin widening. Sophie rolled her eyes, but she couldn't hide her smile as she opened the bag to find a neatly packed sandwich and a small container of fruit. The simple kindness of the gesture warmed her in a way she hadn't expected. On another occasion, Sophie was struggling to carry a heavy box of new arrivals to the back room when Eve appeared seemingly out of nowhere. "Need a hand?" Eve asked, already taking the box from her arms before Sophie could protest. "Do you always show up at the perfect moment?" Sophie asked, raising an eyebrow as she followed Eve to the back room. "It's a gift," Eve said with a wink. Sophie shook her head, trying to hide the blush creeping up her neck. "Thank you," she said softly. Eve set the box down with ease, brushing her hands against her jeans. "Anytime," she said, her voice low and genuine. These moments became routine, little acts of care that drew them closer together. Sophie found herself looking forward to Eve's visits, her heart skipping a beat every time she caught sight of her at the library. But it wasn't just the gestures that lingered in Sophie's mind, it was the way Eve made her feel. For the first time in years, Sophie felt like she could breathe again. The walls she had built around herself, the ones she thought were impenetrable, began to crack under Eve's quiet persistence. And then there was the way Eve looked at her, not with pity or obligation, but with a warmth that made Sophie's chest ache. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, and she wasn't sure how to navigate the emotions that surged whenever they were together. One evening, as they sat on the steps outside the library after closing, Sophie turned to Eve, her heart pounding in her chest. "Why do you keep showing up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eve looked at her, surprise flickering across her face before it softened into something unreadable. "Because I want to," she said simply. Sophie bit her lip, her pulse quickening. "You don't owe me anything, you know." "For that night." "I know," Eve said, her voice steady. "But I like being around you, Sophie. You make things quieter." "Quieter," Sophie repeated, her brows furrowing. Eve nodded, her gaze dropping for a moment before meeting Sophie's again. "Yeah. Like everything makes sense for a little while." Sophie's breath caught, her heart swelling at the vulnerability in Eve's words. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, letting the silence between them speak for itself. And in that silence, something shifted, something fragile and new but undeniably real. The evening was quiet, the world outside Sophie's apartment muted by the first hints of winter snow. A soft glow from a single lamp bathed the living room in warm light, casting long shadows across the walls lined with books. Sophie sat cross-legged on the couch, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, while Eve lounged in the armchair opposite her, flipping through a well-worn paperback. It was an easy, comfortable silence, the kind that had become a natural part of their time together. But tonight there was something different in the air, an unspoken tension, a charge that hummed just beneath the surface. Sophie could feel it in the way Eve's eyes lingered on her a little longer than usual, in the way her own heart raced every time Eve smiled. "Are you always this serious when you read?" Sophie teased, her voice breaking the quiet. Eve glanced up, a crooked grin spreading across her face. "Depends on the book," she said, setting it down on the coffee table. "But this one's pretty good." Sophie smiled, her gaze dropping to her tea as she swirled the liquid absently. "You know," she began hesitantly, "I never thought I'd feel this way again. Like I could actually let someone in." Eve's grin faded, replaced by a softness that made Sophie's chest ache. "Sophie," she said quietly, leaning forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "You've been through a lot. It's okay to be cautious." "I know," Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly. "But with you it's different. I don't feel scared. I feel safe." Eve's brows knit together, her blue eyes searching Sophie's face. "You don't have to say that," she said, her voice low, almost unsure. "But it's true," Sophie said, meeting her gaze. The room fell into a charged silence, the weight of Sophie's words hanging between them. Slowly, Eve stood, crossing the short distance between them before sitting down on the edge of the couch beside her. Safe, Eve repeated softly, her hand reaching out to brush a stray strand of hair from Sophie's face. I never thought I'd hear someone say that about me. Sophie's breath caught at the gentle touch, her pulse quickening as she looked up into Eve's eyes. Why not? She whispered. Eve hesitated, her hand hovering just above Sophie's cheek. Because I've spent so much of my life being something else. Someone else. But with you, I don't feel like I have to be that person anymore. The vulnerability in Eve's voice made Sophie's heart swell, and before she could second-guess herself she leaned forward, her lips brushing softly against Eve's. The kiss was tentative at first, a gentle meeting of lips that sent a shiver down Sophie's spine. But as Eve's hand moved to cup the back of Sophie's neck, deepening the kiss, it quickly became something more. Sophie's hands found their way to Eve's shoulders, pulling her closer as her body leaned into the kiss, her mind awash with 1,000 emotions. She felt the warmth of Eve's touch, the strength of her arms as they wrapped around her, and the way her lips moved with a desperate kind of tenderness, as though this was something neither of them had expected but both had been waiting for. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths mingling in the space between them, Sophie's cheeks were flushed, her heart racing. Wow, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Eve chuckled, her forehead resting against Sophie's. Yeah, she murmured. Wow. The moments that followed blurred into something both tender and electric. Eve lifted Sophie effortlessly, carrying her to the bedroom with a confidence that left Sophie breathless. The world outside melted away, leaving only the two of them and the warmth of the room as they explored each other with an intimacy neither had known in far too long. Sophie's hands roamed over Eve's shoulders, her back, memorizing every curve, every scar. Eve's touch was reverent, her fingers tracing lines along Sophie's skin as though committing her to memory. They moved together with an unspoken rhythm, their breaths mingling in soft gasps and whispered names. It wasn't just physical, it was a breaking of barriers, a giving of trust that neither had realized they were capable of. For Sophie, it was a reminder that she could be vulnerable without fear. For Eve, it was a glimpse of redemption, a moment of being seen and accepted for exactly who she was. Hours later, they lay tangled in the sheets, the room dimly lit by the glow of the streetlights outside. Sophie rested her head on Eve's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. Are you okay? Eve asked softly, her fingers threading through Sophie's hair. Sophie tilted her head to look up at her, a sleepy smile playing on her lips. More than okay, she said. Eve smiled, her eyes glinting with a mixture of affection and disbelief. You have no idea how much you mean to me, she said quietly. Sophie's heart swelled at the words and she reached up to cup Eve's cheek. And you mean everything to me, she said. Eve pressed a kiss to Sophie's forehead, pulling her closer as they settled into the quiet of the night. For the first time in years, both of them felt whole, like they had finally found a place they belonged. Together. The evening had been warm and comfortable, the kind of night Sophie had started to associate with Eve. They had shared takeout on the worn leather couch in Eve's living room, laughing over old stories and playful teasing. The dim light from the single lamp on the side table cast a soft glow over the space, illuminating the faint smile lines that crept across Eve's face when she laughed. It felt normal, easy, like the walls Sophie had spent so long building around herself were finally gone. But as Eve disappeared into the kitchen to grab another round of drinks, Sophie's curiosity got the better of her. Her gaze drifted to a stack of papers and photographs on a nearby shelf, partially hidden beneath a dusty wrench. Something about the corner of an old photograph sticking out from the pile caught her attention, and before she could think twice, Sophie reached out and pulled it free. The image was faded, clearly well-worn, but the figures in the picture were unmistakable. Eve stood on the left, younger but still carrying the same sharp intensity that Sophie had come to know. Beside her was a man in a stiff military uniform, his face stern and unreadable. Eve's arm was draped loosely over his shoulder, but the smile on her face didn't reach her eyes. Sophie's stomach twisted as a chill swept over her. She couldn't say why the photo unsettled her, but something about it felt wrong. What are you doing? Eve's voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Sophie startled, the photograph slipping from her fingers back onto the shelf. She turned to see Eve standing in the doorway, her expression a mask of tension. I wasn't snooping, Sophie stammered, her voice trembling. I just saw the picture and… Eve crossed the room in 2 long strides, snatching the photo off the shelf before Sophie could finish her sentence. Her movements were quick and precise, the kind Sophie had only seen before when Eve was working on a car. It's nothing, Eve said curtly, her tone cold and clipped. She tucked the photograph into the back pocket of her jeans, as if hiding it would erase the moment entirely. Sophie frowned, stepping closer despite the sudden chill in the air. Eve, who is he? She asked softly. The man in the picture. Was he… Drop it, Sophie, Eve interrupted, her voice low but firm. Sophie blinked, taken aback by the harshness in Eve's tone. I just want to understand, she said, her words careful but pleading. If it's something from your past, maybe it would help to talk about it. I said drop it, Eve snapped, her eyes flashing with something Sophie couldn't quite place. Anger? Fear? The tension in the room was suffocating now and Sophie's heart sank. This wasn't the Eve she knew, the warm, steady presence that had become her anchor. This Eve was distant, closed off, a stranger cloaked in walls so high Sophie couldn't see over them. I don't understand why you won't just tell me, Sophie said, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. I thought we were past this, keeping things from each other. Eve's jaw tightened, her hands balling into fists at her sides. You don't understand because you don't need to, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. This is my business, Sophie. Not yours. The words struck like a physical blow, and Sophie's chest tightened as tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. I thought I was more than that to you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Eve flinched, her expression faltering for the briefest moment. But just as quickly the mask was back in place. She turned away, running a hand through her hair as if trying to compose herself. You should go, Eve said finally, her voice devoid of emotion. Sophie froze, her heart dropping into her stomach. What? I said you should go, Eve repeated, her back still to Sophie. Eve, please. Go, Sophie, Eve said sharply, turning to face her. Her expression was hard, but her eyes betrayed her, a flicker of pain, of regret that made Sophie hesitate. The room was silent save for the sound of Sophie's shaky breaths. For a moment she thought about fighting, about staying and demanding that Eve let her in. But the walls between them felt impenetrable now, and Sophie's chest ached with the weight of rejection. Without another word, she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused, glancing back at Eve one last time. Eve stood in the center of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on the floor. She looked small, vulnerable in a way that broke Sophie's heart. If you ever decide you're ready to let me in, Sophie said softly, her voice trembling, you know where to find me. Eve didn't respond, didn't even look up, and Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat as she stepped out into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap, but Sophie hardly noticed as she made her way down the street. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, hurt, and an overwhelming sense of loss. She didn't understand what had just happened, why a single photograph had been enough to shatter the fragile connection they had built. But more than anything, she couldn't shake the image of Eve's expression as she walked away, a mixture of fear and sorrow that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets. And as Sophie turned the corner, disappearing into the dark, one thought lingered above all else. She wasn't ready to give up on Eve. Not yet. The days after Sophie left Eve's apartment were heavy with silence. Every time Sophie glanced at her phone, she hoped to see a message or a missed call from Eve, some small sign that the distance between them was temporary. But there was nothing. The absence stung. Sophie replayed the scene in her mind over and over. The coldness in Eve's voice, the pain in her eyes, and the photo that had set everything into motion. The image of the man in the uniform lingered like a shadow, his stern expression etched into her memory. It didn't make sense. Who was he? And why had seeing that picture thrown Eve into such turmoil? Sophie had always sensed that Eve carried secrets, but now they loomed between them, larger and darker than she'd ever imagined. Sophie tried to push it aside, tried to focus on work and the comforting routine of the library. But the questions gnawed at her, and the more she tried to ignore them, the louder they became. Finally, on a rainy evening after the library had closed, Sophie gave in. She pulled out her laptop, settled into her favorite armchair and began to search. It started with the photo. Sophie couldn't remember much detail about the man's uniform, but she typed in everything she could recall. Military, government, and classified missions. The search returned countless articles, most of them unrelated. Hours passed, the rain outside turning to a steady downpour as Sophie sifted through information. Her frustration grew until at last she stumbled upon something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a grainy image in an old news article. The photo showed a man in a uniform, older, his hair grayer but unmistakably the same man from Eve's photo. The caption identified him as Colonel David Carter, a former intelligence officer who had been involved in covert operations for the U.S. government. Sophie's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart pounding as she scrolled through the article. It detailed a controversial mission from years ago, one that had ended in failure and sparked whispers of corruption within the agency. Several lives had been lost and the details of what happened had been classified, shrouding the event in mystery. But one thing was clear: Colonel Carter had been at the center of it all. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Colonel Carter. Was it just a coincidence that he shared the same last name as Eve? Or was there more to it? She searched again, this time adding Evelyn Carter to the mix. The results were sparse, but one caught her attention. A brief mention in a forgotten blog post about government whistleblowers. The post described a young woman, rumored to be the daughter of a high-ranking official, who had allegedly walked away from a military career under mysterious circumstances. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Could it be her Eve? Her chest tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. Eve's strength, her precision, the way she carried herself. It all fit. And the way she had reacted to the photo, the way she had shut down completely. It wasn't just pain. It was fear. The realization left Sophie reeling. She closed her laptop, staring blankly at the wall as her thoughts spiraled. Eve had told her so little about her past, but now Sophie could see why. If Eve was connected to the failed mission, if she was tied to whatever secrets Colonel Carter had taken to his grave, then the weight she carried made sense. But it also made Sophie's heart ache. She thought of the moments they'd shared, the quiet conversations, the laughter, the way Eve had looked at her with something vulnerable and real. Beneath the walls Eve had built around herself, Sophie had seen someone kind, someone who wanted to be known but didn't know how. And now Sophie understood why. But understanding didn't make it easier. As much as Sophie wanted to help, she didn't know if Eve would ever let her in. The next day, Sophie sat at her desk in the library, distracted as she flipped through a stack of returned books. Her thoughts were consumed by Eve, by the secrets she carried and the ache of the distance between them. "You okay, Sophie?" her coworker Mary asked, leaning against the desk. Sophie forced a smile. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." The room was silent save for the sound of Sophie's shaky breaths. For a moment she thought about fighting, about staying and demanding that Eve let her in. But the walls between them felt impenetrable now, and Sophie's chest ached with the weight of rejection. Without another word, she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. As she reached the threshold, she paused, glancing back at Eve one last time. Eve stood in the center of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed on the floor. She looked small, vulnerable in a way that broke Sophie's heart. "If you ever decide you're ready to let me in," Sophie said softly, her voice trembling, "you know where to find me." Eve didn't respond, didn't even look up, and Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat as she stepped out into the night. The cold air hit her like a slap, but Sophie hardly noticed as she made her way down the street. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions, confusion, hurt, and an overwhelming sense of loss. She didn't understand what had just happened, why a single photograph had been enough to shatter the fragile connection they had built. But more than anything, she couldn't shake the image of Eve's expression as she walked away, a mixture of fear and sorrow that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 secrets. And as Sophie turned the corner, disappearing into the dark, one thought lingered above all else. She wasn't ready to give up on Eve. Not yet. The days after Sophie left Eve's apartment were heavy with silence. Every time Sophie glanced at her phone, she hoped to see a message or a missed call from Eve, some small sign that the distance between them was temporary. But there was nothing. The absence stung. Sophie replayed the scene in her mind over and over. The coldness in Eve's voice, the pain in her eyes, and the photo that had set everything into motion. The image of the man in the uniform lingered like a shadow, his stern expression etched into her memory. It didn't make sense. Who was he? And why had seeing that picture thrown Eve into such turmoil? Sophie had always sensed that Eve carried secrets, but now they loomed between them, larger and darker than she'd ever imagined. Sophie tried to push it aside, tried to focus on work and the comforting routine of the library. But the questions gnawed at her, and the more she tried to ignore them, the louder they became. Finally, on a rainy evening after the library had closed, Sophie gave in. She pulled out her laptop, settled into her favorite armchair and began to search. It started with the photo. Sophie couldn't remember much detail about the man's uniform, but she typed in everything she could recall. Military, government, and classified missions. The search returned countless articles, most of them unrelated. Hours passed, the rain outside turning to a steady downpour as Sophie sifted through information. Her frustration grew until at last she stumbled upon something that made her heart skip a beat. It was a grainy image in an old news article. The photo showed a man in a uniform, older, his hair grayer but unmistakably the same man from Eve's photo. The caption identified him as Colonel David Carter, a former intelligence officer who had been involved in covert operations for the U.S. government. Sophie's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her heart pounding as she scrolled through the article. It detailed a controversial mission from years ago, one that had ended in failure and sparked whispers of corruption within the agency. Several lives had been lost and the details of what happened had been classified, shrouding the event in mystery. But one thing was clear: Colonel Carter had been at the center of it all. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Colonel Carter. Was it just a coincidence that he shared the same last name as Eve? Or was there more to it? She searched again, this time adding Evelyn Carter to the mix. The results were sparse, but one caught her attention. A brief mention in a forgotten blog post about government whistleblowers. The post described a young woman, rumored to be the daughter of a high-ranking official, who had allegedly walked away from a military career under mysterious circumstances. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Could it be her Eve? Her chest tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. Eve's strength, her precision, the way she carried herself. It all fit. And the way she had reacted to the photo, the way she had shut down completely. It wasn't just pain. It was fear. The realization left Sophie reeling. She closed her laptop, staring blankly at the wall as her thoughts spiraled. Eve had told her so little about her past, but now Sophie could see why. If Eve was connected to the failed mission, if she was tied to whatever secrets Colonel Carter had taken to his grave, then the weight she carried made sense. But it also made Sophie's heart ache. She thought of the moments they'd shared, the quiet conversations, the laughter, the way Eve had looked at her with something vulnerable and real. Beneath the walls Eve had built around herself, Sophie had seen someone kind, someone who wanted to be known but didn't know how. And now Sophie understood why. But understanding didn't make it easier. As much as Sophie wanted to help, she didn't know if Eve would ever let her in. The next day, Sophie sat at her desk in the library, distracted as she flipped through a stack of returned books. Her thoughts were consumed by Eve, by the secrets she carried and the ache of the distance between them. "You okay, Sophie?" her coworker Mary asked, leaning against the desk. Sophie forced a smile. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." Mary nodded, her expression sympathetic. "Well, if you need to talk, you know where to find me." Sophie nodded, appreciating the offer but knowing this wasn't something she could share. As Mary walked away, Sophie made a decision. She couldn't sit in the dark, waiting for answers that might never come. If Eve wouldn't talk to her, Sophie would have to find another way. That evening, Sophie found herself standing outside Eve's garage. The lights inside were dim, the door partially open. She hesitated, her heart pounding as she debated whether to go in. Before she could decide, the door creaked open further and Eve stepped out. She froze when she saw Sophie, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Sophie," Eve said, her voice guarded. "What are you doing here?" Sophie met her gaze, summoning every ounce of courage she had. "We need to talk," she said firmly. Eve's jaw tightened and for a moment Sophie thought she might turn her away again. But then Eve sighed, stepping aside and gesturing for Sophie to come in. As Sophie stepped into the garage, her heart ached at the sight of the woman she cared for, burdened by a past she hadn't yet shared. And as she prepared to confront the truth, Sophie knew one thing for certain. She wasn't ready to give up on Eve. Not now. Not ever. The cold Boston night seeped into the edges of the garage as Eve sat alone on a worn stool, the faint hum of the overhead light the only sound breaking the silence. She held a photo in her hand, the same photo that had fractured everything between her and Sophie. Her fingers trembled as she traced the faded edges, her eyes locked on the image of herself and Colonel David Carter. The man in the picture had been more than a mentor. He had been her guiding force, the one who had trained her, believed in her potential and turned her into an elite operative. But he had also been the one to give the order that had changed her life forever. Eve squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the flood of memories. The mission had been a covert operation, the kind that didn't exist on paper. She and her team had been tasked with extracting a high-value target from a hostile zone, but something had gone terribly wrong. Misinformation had led them into a trap, and in the chaos that followed, civilians had been caught in the crossfire. The memory of their faces haunted her, the terror in their eyes, the screams that still echoed in her mind at night. Eve had fought to save them, to undo the damage, but it had been too late. The blame had fallen on her team, on her, and though she had been cleared of wrongdoing officially, the guilt had never left her. Eve stood abruptly, pacing the length of the garage as her thoughts spiraled. She had left that life behind, abandoning the agency and cutting ties with everyone she had known. For years she had buried herself in the simplicity of fixing cars, the tangible satisfaction of taking something broken and making it whole again. But the scars of her past remained, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for moments like this to resurface and tear her apart. Sophie's face flashed in her mind, her kind eyes, the softness in her voice when she said she felt safe around Eve. That memory was both a balm and a dagger. How could Sophie feel safe with someone like her, someone who had brought so much destruction into the world? Eve sank back onto the stool, her head in her hands. She had tried so hard to keep Sophie at arm's length, to protect her from the shadows that followed her. But Sophie's persistence, her warmth, had broken through those walls, and for the first time in years, Eve had felt something other than guilt. She had felt hope. Sophie was different. She wasn't jaded or cynical like the people Eve had spent most of her life around. There was a purity to her, an openness that made Eve want to be better, to be someone worthy of that trust. But the fear lingered, sharp and unrelenting. What if her past caught up to her? The agency had let her walk away, but not without warnings. The information she carried, the knowledge of missions and names, made her a liability. If anyone from her former life decided she was a threat, it wouldn't just be her in danger. Sophie could be caught in the crossfire, and the thought of anything happening to her because of Eve was unbearable. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms as she tried to steady her breathing. It would be safer for Sophie to stay away, to live her life without the weight of Eve's darkness dragging her down. But that thought was a double-edged sword. The idea of losing Sophie, of pushing her away forever, felt like a fresh wound opening in her chest. Eve reached for a cigarette from a crumpled pack on the workbench, lighting it with shaking hands. She inhaled deeply, the burn in her lungs grounding her, if only for a moment. The truth was, she was selfish. She wanted Sophie in her life, wanted the light she brought into Eve's otherwise bleak existence. But wanting and deserving were two different things, and Eve wasn't sure she could reconcile the two. Her mind drifted to the way Sophie had looked at her the night she left. Hurt, confused, but still hopeful. That hope had been a gift, and Eve had thrown it away. The garage door creaked as the wind picked up outside, rattling the tools on the walls. Eve stared at the photo in her hand one last time before tucking it into her pocket. She stood, her resolve hardening as she paced to the window. She needed to protect Sophie, even if it meant keeping her distance. But part of her knew that was a lie. Sophie had already become part of her world, whether Eve wanted to admit it or not. The question now was whether Eve had the strength to face her demons, to confront the ghosts of her past and carve out a future that didn't feel so suffocating. She thought of Sophie again, the warmth of her laugh, the way her touch had eased a pain Eve hadn't realized she was carrying. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. But it wouldn't be easy. And as much as Eve wanted to protect Sophie from the shadows, she couldn't ignore the possibility that Sophie might be the light strong enough to banish them. For the first time in years, Eve allowed herself a small, fragile hope. But with that hope came a deep, gnawing fear, because letting Sophie in meant risking everything. And Eve wasn't sure if she was brave enough to take that chance. Not yet. The knock on the garage door echoed in the quiet of the evening, breaking the rhythm of Eve's thoughts. She froze, her wrench slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the concrete floor. For a moment she considered ignoring it, pretending she wasn't there. But the knock came again, firmer this time, and something in its urgency made her stomach twist. Slowly, she wiped her hands on the rag hanging from her back pocket and approached the door. When she pulled it open, the sight of Sophie standing there stole the breath from her lungs. Sophie's expression was a mixture of determination and vulnerability, her coat pulled tightly around her as the cold wind nipped at her cheeks. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes locking onto Eve's. "We need to talk," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. Eve closed the door behind her, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. "Why did you push me away?" Sophie asked, her voice breaking the silence. "Why couldn't you just tell me the truth?" Eve sighed, running a hand through her hair as she turned away, unable to meet Sophie's gaze. "Because the truth is messy," she said finally, her voice low. "It's ugly. And I didn't want you to see that part of me." Sophie stepped closer, her frustration evident in the tight set of her jaw. "You think I can't handle messy? That I'd just run the moment things got complicated?" Eve turned back to her, her blue eyes filled with a pain that Sophie hadn't seen before. "I don't want you to have to handle it, Sophie. You deserve better than the kind of baggage I bring." "Stop deciding what I deserve," Sophie said sharply. "You don't get to make that choice for me." Eve's shoulders sagged under the weight of her guilt, and she leaned against the workbench, her hands gripping its edge. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "If I let you in, really let you in, you'd see things you can't unsee. And I can't ask you to carry that." "Then don't ask," Sophie said, her voice softening. "Just tell me." The words hung in the air and Eve could feel Sophie's gaze piercing through her defenses. She took a deep breath, her chest tight as she prepared to say the words she had been running from for years. "I used to work for the government," Eve began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was part of a covert operations unit, Black Ops. The kind of missions that don't make it into the history books." Sophie's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. She just stood there waiting for Eve to continue. "We were trained for the impossible," Eve said, her gaze distant as she spoke. "In and out, no questions asked. But one mission," her voice faltered and she closed her eyes, the memories flooding back. "One mission went wrong. Really wrong." She opened her eyes, meeting Sophie's gaze, her expression raw. "We were given bad intel. A civilian village was caught in the crossfire. Innocent people died because of us. Because of me." Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, her breath hitching as the weight of Eve's words settled over her. "They tried to pin the blame on faulty equipment, on bad timing," Eve continued, her voice breaking. "But I knew the truth. I was there. I saw what happened. And I couldn't fix it. I couldn't save them." Eve's voice cracked and she turned away, her hands gripping the workbench so tightly her knuckles turned white. "That's why I left. I couldn't do it anymore. Carry out orders that hurt people, that broke me. I walked away from it all. But the things I've seen, the things I've done, they don't just disappear." Sophie took a tentative step closer, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Eve." Eve shook her head, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have to deal with that, Sophie. You shouldn't have to deal with me." "Stop," Sophie said firmly, placing a hand on Eve's arm. "You don't get to decide that. You think I don't see who you are? You think I don't know that you've been carrying this alone for so long?" Eve looked at her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can't lose you," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I can't drag you into this. It's not fair." "What's not fair is you shutting me out," Sophie said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You think your past makes you unworthy, but it doesn't. It just makes you human." Eve's resolve cracked and she let out a shaky breath. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I've spent so long running, keeping people at a distance. But you're different. You make me want to stop running." Sophie's heart swelled at the admission and she reached up to cup Eve's cheek, her thumb brushing away a tear that had slipped free. "Then stop," she said softly. "Let me in. Let me be here for you." Eve hesitated, her fear warring with the hope in Sophie's eyes. And then finally she nodded, her walls crumbling as she leaned into Sophie's touch. "I don't deserve you," Eve whispered. "That's not for you to decide," Sophie replied, her voice steady. As they stood there in the quiet of the garage, their emotions raw and exposed, Eve felt something she hadn't in years, a glimmer of peace. And as Sophie wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly, Eve allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, she could have a future that wasn't defined by her past. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Eve sat at her kitchen table, a half-empty mug of coffee growing cold in her hands. She had been restless since her conversation with Sophie, her emotions still raw and tangled. Opening up to Sophie had felt like peeling back armor she'd worn for years, exposing every fragile, unprotected part of herself. It was terrifying and freeing. But the stillness of the night didn't ease her mind. Her instincts, honed from years of training, told her something was off, a tension in the air she couldn't shake. When her phone vibrated on the table, the sound made her flinch. She reached for it, the screen glowing with an unknown number. Frowning, she hesitated before answering. "Evelyn Carter," came a familiar voice, low and clipped. Eve's breath caught. She hadn't heard that voice in years, but she recognized it instantly. "Collins," she said, her voice guarded. "What the hell do you want?" There was a pause on the other end, and then Collins spoke again, his tone sharp. "You're in danger." Eve stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Cut to the chase," she said, her grip tightening on the phone. "Who's coming after me?" "Someone who thinks you know more than you let on," Collins replied. "And they're not going to stop until they get answers." Eve's jaw clenched. "I don't have answers. You know that." "I know," Collins said, his voice quieter now, almost sympathetic. "But they don't. And you were always the loose end, Carter." Eve's pulse raced as she turned to look out the window. The street below was dark, deserted, but her paranoia made every shadow seem like a threat. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you saved my life once," Collins said, his tone softening. "I owe you that much. But you need to be careful. They're not playing games." Eve's chest tightened, a sinking feeling settling in her gut. "Do they know where I am?" "Not yet," Collins said. "But it's only a matter of time. Watch your back, Carter." The line went dead. Eve stared at the phone, her mind spinning. She had tried to leave that world behind, to bury the past and live a life far removed from the chaos and danger of her former career. But it seemed the past had found her, dragging her back into a nightmare she thought she'd escaped. Her thoughts immediately went to Sophie. Sophie had trusted her, had stood by her even after learning the truth. But now, Sophie was vulnerable in a way that made Eve's stomach twist with fear. If whoever was looking for her decided to use Sophie as leverage. Eve cursed under her breath, pacing the length of the kitchen. She needed to think, to plan. The first step was simple. Keep Sophie safe. The next day, Eve showed up at the library just as Sophie was finishing her shift. Sophie looked up from the desk, her face lighting up when she saw Eve. But her smile faded as soon as she noticed Eve's tense expression. "What's wrong?" Sophie asked, stepping out from behind the desk. Eve glanced around, scanning the room for anyone who might be watching. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. Sophie's brow furrowed with concern, but she nodded. "Hey, let me grab my coat." They walked to a nearby park, the brisk winter air biting at their skin. Eve kept her hands stuffed in her jacket pockets, her eyes darting to every passing figure, every parked car. "You're scaring me," Sophie said softly as they stopped near a bench. "What's going on?" Eve hesitated, struggling to find the right words. Finally, she turned to Sophie, her expression grim. "Someone from my past is looking for me," she said. "And they're not the kind of person who just asks nicely." Sophie's eyes widened. "Why? What do they want?" "They think I know something about a mission that went south years ago," Eve explained. "But I don't. They're chasing ghosts, but that doesn't make them any less dangerous." Sophie swallowed hard, her breath visible in the cold air. "Do they know about me?" "No," Eve said quickly. "And I'm going to make sure it stays that way." Sophie reached for Eve's hand, her grip firm. "You don't have to do this alone." "Yes, I do," Eve said, her voice trembling. "If anything happened to you because of me," she trailed off, her throat tightening. "I'm not going anywhere," Sophie said, her eyes fierce. "You don't get to push me away again." Eve looked at her, her heart aching at the resolve in Sophie's expression. She wanted to argue, to tell Sophie that this wasn't her fight. But she knew Sophie wouldn't back down. "Okay," Eve said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. But you have to promise me something. What? Sophie asked. If things get bad, really bad, you run, Eve said. You don't wait for me. You just go. Sophie shook her head. I'm not making that promise. Sophie. No, Sophie interrupted. We're in this together, Eve. You're not alone anymore. Eve closed her eyes, the weight of Sophie's words sinking in. For so long she had carried the burden of her past alone, convinced that no one could, or should, shoulder it with her. But now, standing here with Sophie, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Still, the danger was real, and Eve knew they had a fight ahead of them. She just didn't know how long they had before the past came knocking on her door. The night was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch forever. Sophie sat on the edge of Eve's worn leather couch, her nerves on edge as her eyes darted to the windows, checking for any movement outside. Eve stood near the doorway, her arms crossed and her expression grim, her silhouette outlined by the dim glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds. You should stay at a friend's place tonight, Eve said, her voice low but firm. Sophie shook her head, her resolve unwavering. No. Sophie, I'm serious, Eve said, stepping closer. These people aren't going to play nice. They'll use anyone and anything against me. If they know about you, then we'll handle it, Sophie interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. I'm not running, Eve. I won't leave you to face this alone. Eve clenched her jaw, her frustration evident, but there was something else in her eyes, an unmistakable flicker of gratitude. You're too damn stubborn, Eve muttered, running a hand through her hair. Sophie stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Eve's arm. And you're too used to being alone, she said softly. Let me be here for you. Eve sighed, her shoulders sagging as the tension momentarily eased. I don't know how to protect you from this, Sophie, she admitted, her voice tinged with defeat. You don't have to, Sophie said, her voice firm. We protect each other. The night dragged on, the tension thick in the air. Eve kept glancing at her phone, half expecting a warning or an ultimatum from whoever was hunting her. But as the hours passed in silence, her instincts began to prickle with unease. It was just after midnight when the first sound came, a soft scrape against the front door, barely audible but enough to make Eve freeze. Stay here, Eve whispered, her voice sharp as she motioned for Sophie to stay back. But Sophie followed, her footsteps light as she trailed Eve into the narrow hallway leading to the door. Eve opened a drawer near the door, pulling out a small pistol and checking the safety. She turned to Sophie, her eyes hard. If anything happens, you run. Got it? Sophie didn't answer, her jaw tightening as she crossed her arms defiantly. Before Eve could argue, the door burst open with a deafening crash, and 3 men stormed in, their faces obscured by masks. Miss Carter, one of them said, his voice cold and calculated. You've been a hard woman to find. Eve raised the pistol, her stance steady. Whatever you think I know, I don't have it, she said, her voice like steel. We'll decide that, the man said, motioning to one of his accomplices. The second man lunged toward Eve and chaos erupted. Eve moved like lightning, disarming the first attacker with a swift twist of his wrist. The pistol clattered to the floor as Eve blocked a punch from the second man, her movements fluid and precise. But there were too many. As Eve struggled against one of the men, the other advanced toward Sophie, who had backed into the corner of the room. Don't touch her, Eve shouted, her voice laced with fury. Sophie's heart pounded, her breath coming in sharp gasps as the man loomed closer. Her eyes darted to the lamp on the side table, its heavy base gleaming faintly in the dim light. Without thinking, Sophie grabbed the lamp and swung it with all her strength. The base connected with the man's head and he stumbled backward, stunned. Eve took advantage of the distraction, delivering a sharp kick to her attacker's chest before grabbing Sophie's hand. Run! Eve shouted, pulling Sophie toward the back door. They burst into the cold night air, their breaths visible as they sprinted into the alley behind the garage. The sound of footsteps and shouted orders echoed behind them, but Eve's grip on Sophie's hand was unrelenting. This way! Eve hissed, leading Sophie through a maze of alleys and side streets. They finally stopped in an abandoned lot, both of them panting as they leaned against a crumbling brick wall. Eve turned to Sophie, her expression a mix of anger and relief. You could have been killed, Eve said, her voice shaking. But I wasn't, Sophie replied, her tone fierce. And neither were you. We did this together. Eve stared at her, the intensity of the moment making her chest tighten. She reached out, her hand cupping Sophie's cheek. "You're unbelievable," she said softly. Sophie smiled, despite the fear still thrumming through her veins. "And you're not as invincible as you think." Eve let out a shaky laugh, pulling Sophie into a tight embrace. For the first time in a long time she felt something other than fear, she felt hope. The next day Eve made a decision. She called Collins, her former colleague, and arranged a meeting with some of her old contacts. It was time to end the cycle of running and fear, to prove her innocence once and for all. With Sophie by her side, Eve confronted the shadows of her past. She provided the evidence she had kept hidden for years, exposing the truth about the mission that had gone wrong and clearing her name. The process was grueling, filled with tense negotiations and reliving painful memories. But through it all, Sophie remained a steady presence, her unwavering support giving Eve the strength to keep going. When it was finally over, Eve felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a weight she had carried for far too long. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into something new. Sophie and Eve rebuilt their routines, but there was a closeness now that hadn't been there before. A quiet understanding that their bond had been forged in fire. One evening as they sat on the couch together, Sophie turned to Eve with a small smile. "So what now?" Eve looked at her, her expression soft. "Now," she said, "we figure out what a future looks like. Together." Sophie leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to Eve's lips. "I like the sound of that." And for the first time in years, Eve allowed herself to believe that a future filled with love and light was something she deserved. The morning light filtered through the windows of Sophie's apartment, casting a warm glow over the small living room. The once cluttered coffee table now held a vase of fresh flowers, a habit Sophie had picked up recently, inspired by Eve's suggestion to add some life to the place. Eve stood in the kitchen, a mug of coffee in hand as she leaned against the counter, her gaze drifting towards Sophie, who was curled up on the couch with a book. Sophie looked peaceful, her hair falling in soft waves around her face, and for a moment, Eve let herself simply enjoy the quiet, the normalcy. It was still new to her, the sense of calm. After years of running and hiding, she wasn't entirely sure she deserved it. But Sophie's presence had become an anchor, a reminder that redemption wasn't about erasing the past but about building something better in its wake. "Are you going to stare at me all morning, or are you going to sit down?" Sophie teased, her voice light but her smile knowing. Eve smirked, pushing off the counter and walking over to join her. "Can't help it," she said, settling onto the couch beside Sophie. "You're distracting." "Distracting?" Sophie raised an eyebrow, setting her book aside. "From what? You have nowhere to be." Eve chuckled, wrapping an arm around Sophie's shoulders and pulling her close. "From everything. And nothing." Their days had begun to find a rhythm, a balance between the quiet moments they shared and the lives they were rebuilding. Sophie had returned to the library, her days filled with books and curious patrons, while Eve had started taking on projects at her garage again, slowly reopening the doors she had closed when her past had caught up with her. But their nights were theirs alone, a sanctuary where they could talk, laugh, and sometimes sit in silence, content just to be near each other. One evening, as they sat on the floor in front of the couch, a half-finished puzzle spread out between them, Sophie spoke, her voice thoughtful. "You know, I used to think fear was what kept me from really living," she said, placing a puzzle piece into its spot. Eve looked at her, curious. "What changed?" Sophie smiled softly, her eyes meeting Eve's. "You." Eve's brow furrowed and Sophie reached out, placing her hand over Eve's. "You challenged me," Sophie said, her voice steady. "You made me realize that it wasn't fear holding me back. It was the belief that I didn't deserve more. That I couldn't handle more. But with you I've learned that I can. And that I want to." Eve's throat tightened and she looked down at their intertwined hands. "You give me too much credit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie shook her head. "No. I give you exactly what you deserve." For Eve, Sophie's words were both a balm and a mirror, reflecting parts of herself she hadn't been ready to face. Sophie saw her not as a collection of mistakes and regrets but as someone worth loving, worth fighting for. And slowly Eve began to believe it too. Their journey hadn't been easy. The shadows of Eve's past still lingered, and there were moments when doubt threatened to creep back in. But they faced those moments together, leaning on the trust and understanding they had built. Sophie had proven to Eve that she wasn't defined by the darkness she carried. And Eve had shown Sophie that vulnerability wasn't a weakness but a strength. One weekend they decided to take a trip out of the city, driving up the coast to a small seaside town. The salty breeze and the sound of waves crashing against the shore created a sense of freedom neither of them had felt in a long time. As they walked along the beach, their hands entwined, Sophie glanced at Eve, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what's next?" she asked. Eve smirked. "Are you asking if I have a 5-year plan?" Sophie laughed, nudging her playfully. "No. I mean, what do you want? For us?" Eve stopped walking, turning to face Sophie. She reached up, tucking a strand of hair behind Sophie's ear as she searched her face. "What I want," Eve said, her voice steady, "is this. You me. Figuring it out as we go. No plans, no expectations. Just." Sophie's eyes softened and she leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to Eve's lips. "That sounds perfect," she murmured. Back in Boston, life continued, but the love they had found in each other gave every day a sense of purpose. Sophie found herself more confident, more willing to take risks, whether it was suggesting new programs at the library or trying her hand at photography, a hobby she had picked up from Eve, who had gifted her a vintage camera. Eve too had changed. She still carried the scars of her past, but they no longer felt like chains. With Sophie's unwavering belief in her, she had started to see herself not as a survivor of her mistakes but as someone capable of building a future. One evening, as they sat on the fire escape outside Sophie's apartment, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights, Sophie rested her head on Eve's shoulder. "You know," Sophie said, her voice quiet, "I used to think the unknown was the scariest thing in the world." Eve tilted her head, looking down at her. "And now?" "Now I think it's the most exciting," Sophie said, her lips curving into a smile. Eve chuckled, pressing a kiss to Sophie's temple. "I like the sound of that," she said. And as the stars twinkled above them, they sat together, their hearts full of love and a quiet certainty that no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. Because sometimes, Eve thought, you had to walk through the darkest parts of yourself to find the light, and she had found hers in Sophie.